Hi everyone, my name is Mark Fitzpatrick. I'm a long-term vegan activist from Cork originally, but I haven't lived there for about 30 years. These days I work with the Vegan Society for New Zealand. I live in Auckland and I campaign for veganism with the Vegan Outreach Program with the society over here. In my downtime, I managed to compile a book on the history of radical animal advocates in Ireland from 1822 to 2022. And the idea for the book came around when I was invited on to a podcast called the Policed Podcast. It's now defunct, sadly, but it was an ongoing podcast that was looking into the experiences that various Irish people had with dealing with the Garda Síochána, the Irish police, for various in various areas. So they were talking with Irish travelers, feminists, radical socialists, people who had been in trouble with the police for various reasons, and I decided to get in touch with them and invite myself on because I had had extensive experience of dealing with the police whilst I was a Hunt Saboteur in Galway, specifically during the early 1990s. So quite a while back, but yeah, I had quite extensive and bitter, I must say, experiences with dealing with the police when we were sabotaging hunts in Galway, specifically the Galway Blazers. So I was doing a bit of research for the upcoming podcast, and I decided to see what had happened of the Hunt Saboteur movement after I'd left Ireland for the UK in the mid-1990s. And I stumbled across a website called the Irish Newspaper Archive. And it's basically every single newspaper that was ever printed in Ireland since the very first editions came out, which was the Belfast Telegraph in 1738, I think. Every newspaper ever printed is there and one on one website. And there's a search engine. So if you put in some keywords, like I put in Hunt Sabotage and animal liberation, hundreds of articles came up, news footage, opinion pieces, letters to the editor, reports, interviews with activists, interviews of people who were victims of activists. There was thousands, there was literally thousands of mentions of the Animal Liberation Front and animal liberation and Hunt Sabotage and so on in the Irish media. So I decided to compile it all into a diary of actions of sort, and then it sort of expanded from there. I started doing it in 2022, and I realized that it was the bicentenary of the first ever state-endorsed act to protect some animals from some violence from people, which was the 1822 Cruelty to Cattle Act. So basically, I decided to expand the narrative and to tell the story of animal advocacy in Ireland from the Cruelty to Cattle Act in 1822, which was spearheaded by Richard Martin, who I'll go into detail now soon about. From there on, so it takes in the very first state act to protect animals from cruelty, the very first vegetarian cafe scene and restaurant scene in Dublin at the turn of the 19th century, to the evolution of the Animal Liberation Front and the Hunt Saboteurs Association in the early 1980s. So it sort of takes in a broad spectrum of activity. The premise was anything that was under the banner of direct action was going to get a mention. If it was direct action and done in the name of animal rights somewhere in Ireland and it was publicly recorded, then I wanted to know about it, and I've compiled it all in this book, essentially. So what I've compiled here is the very least of what's happened. It must be borne in mind that this is the stuff that made it to the media, okay, and it was publicly recorded and then available in some sort of archive, generally online, to someone like me these days. Okay, so this represents the very least of what was going on in Ireland over a 200-year period. The book is with the publishers now. It's due to come out at some point this year, I hope. It's going to be called the Humanity Trigger. I'll explain how I got the name during the as we sift through these images that I've collected here. So if we go forward, if we go in here, basically, I'll talk through the contents of the book using these images as reference points. And all of these images and much more are available on my website, the Humanity Trigger, and most of these will also be in the book. There are some publishing rights issues when you're putting this sort of stuff into a book as opposed to a website. So not all these images are going to make it to the book, but as many as I can get in legally, then I will. So on the left here, we have Thomas Wentworth, who was actually the very first person to pioneer a bill and then an act to get it through Parliament. This was in 1635, I believe. And he introduced the first act to ban tying plows to horses' tails, as opposed to making a harness and a frame for the plow. So it was a common practice in the west of Ireland at the time, because everyone was so piss poor because of people like him, that they had no alternative but to tie their plows directly to the animals that were pulling the plows. An extremely painful process for the animals, right? But the Irish farmers were doing it because they literally couldn't afford any rope or harness. So this guy, he was the Lord Protector of Ireland. He was an Englishman. He was the first Earl of Strafford. Thomas Wentworth introduced the very first parliamentary act banning tying plows to horses' tails and pulling the wool off sheep directly instead of cutting it off with scissors. Again, a practice that was done by Gaelic farmers because they couldn't afford shears. So this is the guy that pushed through the very first protection for legal protection for animals. 1635. It was very corrupt. The license to enforce and collect the fines around the act were pawned off to the highest bidder. So it was a very corrupt way of going about it. It didn't really reduce the problem at all. The quickest way for people like him to stop acts like stop cruelty to cattle like this would have been to allow the Irish farmers to prosper naturally and to be able to afford the equipment that they needed. But in any case, the very first government act to protect Parliament was this guy here. It was pushed through by Thomas Wentworth. But the first significant act and the first act that was enforced by anyone was pushed through by MP Richard Martin, who was the MP for Galway at the time. This is when Ireland was part of the British Empire. So this is the early 18th century. So in 1822, Richard Martin pushed through the very first successful piece of legislation protecting essentially farm animals from gratuitous cruelty. Okay, and that was left up to the magistrates and judges to decide the interpretation of that. But this guy it was Richard Martin where the story gets going really. So we'll get on to the next one. He was so rich and so wealthy, right? He was the top end of the very top end that he had a fiefdom basically in West Galway, and he was able to make up and then enforce his own laws. It was sort of a long tradition in that area. So to that end, this little tower here is an old Viking tower. It's a tiny little islet in the middle of a loch in the far west of Ireland, and it's the very first prison specifically for animal abusers, specifically for donkey beaters. They'd be rowed out here and left here for a few days or a few weeks to think about the bad things that they had done, and they'd be rowed out personally by Richard Martin himself. So he ran his own prison specifically aimed at animal abusers in his area. If he found anyone beating particularly donkeys, he would arrest them and sentence them, and then roll them over here for them to serve out the sentence. So he was working away himself in the background, trying to address the issue of animal cruelty from humans. So initially, before he had his law pushed through, he was like a one-man army. He was known as Richard Hair Trigger Martin because he had a very quick temper, and he was also known as Richard as Humanity Dick because he was very fond of animals. So the name of the book is the Humanity Trigger, which is a combination of bits of his two nicknames together. So before he had the state behind him, he used to hunt down and challenge to duels anyone who he got abusing an animal, instead of rowing them out to the prison that he'd built, or that he created. He would often challenge them to a duel. So a very famous instance was when this guy here up on the top left, with his hand around the boy, it's a painting of a famous gentleman thug called G.R. Fighting Fitzgerald. He was from Mayo, and he was known to have a very belligerent temper. And one day in the late 1700s, he had called around to a mutual friend of his and Martin's, a guy called Lord Altmond, and knocked on his door. They were having some argument over something, and the first thing to come to the door was Lord Altman's dog here, the drawing of his dog, and GR Fighting Fitzgerald shot the dog through the face and killed him instantly. Okay, so under the gentlemanly code, the only person that could challenge Fitzgerald to a duel for doing this was the owner of the dog, Lord Altman, but he was too old and frail. So instead of that, he wouldn't do that. So instead, Martin offered to represent him for free in court, prosecuting Martin for destroying some of his property, because it was before the days of cruelty to animals was enshrined in law. So Martin eviscerated Fitzgerald in the dock for hours and hours, and belittled him over and over again during the day in court. And Fitzgerald had no other choice but to challenge him to a duel, and a duel they had. And this is an illustration of this is Richard Martin shooting G.R. Fitzgerald in the face for shooting this guy's dog. It was a very famous case at the time. These are gentlemen thugs, really, who made headlines everywhere they went. They were the celebrities of their age. But it was Martin that sort of pioneered the whole idea of standing up in such a forthright way for animals. So here we have him. Here's a famous drawing of him fighting a butcher at Smithfield's meat market. It's to represent the introduction of the 1822 Cruelty to Cattle Act, where he would send his RSPCA guys. So the RSPCA were set up by Martin and other people in order to simply enforce this act, and that alone was their job. So they were given uniforms, and they had stations, and they had batons, and they had the legal right to arrest people who they found contravening the new Cruelty to Cattle Act. So so the RSPCA actually started off as quite a radical expression of animal rights, I suppose. And they were a police force. They preempted the police force for humans, the Metropolitan Police, which was the very first police force as we know it. They predated them by about 6 or 7 years, and the modern day police based their command structure and their uniforms on the very early RSPCA. So the RSPCA were once the cutting edge of animal liberation, believe it or not. This is a very famous painting. So it took 16 years for the RSPCA of continually trying to bring animal abusers to court under the new law until they succeeded. And the first court case that Richard Martin, who was also representing the RSPCA and its new law for free in court, it's him here. He's brought the donkey in, the abused donkey. This is Bill Burns, the guy that was arrested by the RSPCA for abusing this donkey. And this is the court scene. All the magistrates here are laughing or smirking, and they can't really believe that they're witnessing this. But however, Martin won the case. So this is the first case after 16 years and dozens of attempts until they actually saw a successful case. Martin then paid for Burns's fine, okay, because he said that he didn't want Burns to be singled out and punished when it was a social problem. He was making an example rather than trying to punish an individual. So thankfully, the RSPCA no longer paid the fines of animal abusers, but on the very first successful case, they did. So moving on to the culinary scene in Ireland, the vegetarian culinary scene started out very, very early, a lot earlier than I thought. I thought it would only go back to the 1970s. It actually goes back to the 1890s. And these are the very first adverts that I saw in a very old newspaper The one on the right here is actually a chain of vegetarian cafes run by a Northern Irishman, Leonard McCaughey. There's one in Belfast, Dublin, Glasgow, Leeds. The one in Glasgow is now a McDonald's, actually, the one in Jamaica Street. But so the 1890s saw the very first tentative vegetarian restaurants in Belfast and Dublin around 1890, 1891. They only lasted for about a year. They were set up and financed by the very early vegetarian societies in Ireland, which were branches of the UK vegetarian movement, the Manchester vegetarian movement. So again, Ireland was still part of the empire. It wasn't an independent country yet, so we were sort of very connected to the British movement as well. Still are. So this it's in the early 19th century when things really get going. Or sorry, the 1900s rather. This is Jenny Wise Power is this woman on the left here, and she set up the first renowned and long-lasting vegetarian cafe in Dublin, 21 Henry Street. It's now I think it's a computer shop now. I think there's a plaque commemorating the site of the cafe because it was where 6 out of the 7 or 7 out of the 8, I can't remember which, of the signatories for the Declaration of Irish Independence, they actually signed their names on the sheet of paper in this cafe, right? So it was called the Irish Farm Produce Cafe. It was run by Jenny Wise Power, who was married to another guy, Power, who the two of them were really high up in Sinn Féin, the Suffragette movement, the radical Republican socialist movement that was huge at the time. She knew Maud Gonne. It was so the cafe that she was running. So vegetarianism at the time, and still is now at its best, is seen, and veganism is part of a broader liberation struggle. So these people then recognized it as such as well, and vegetarianism was very strong amongst a certain strain of generally middle-class radicals around Dublin and London and the bigger cities around the UK like that at the time. So Jenny Wise Power had this Irish farm produce that specialized in vegetarian food. And it attracted all the radicals around Dublin, all the IRA guys. This is just prior to 1916. The basement of the cafe was used as an arms dump for the IRA, because the GPO was just around the corner. And when the rising started in 1916, Jenny Wise Power and her comrades, they blew holes through all the internal walls from their cafe to the GPO so that they could deliver vegetarian, I presume, food to the rebels fighting there for the week-long siege of the GPO during 1916. So the 1916 rising, those guys were fed on vegetarian food that was smuggled to them from her cafe around the corner. It lasted for about 10 years until she became a senator, I think, and she died in 1941. But it was probably at the time, it was probably the most exciting place to get a veggie burger in anywhere in Europe, because it was full of all these radicals from all over Dublin, all over Ireland, and all over the world as well. The inset here of this chap here, this is V.V. Giri, the 6th president of India. And when he was studying law in 1912, he and some of his fellow students from Delhi moved to Dublin just prior to 1916. And being Hindu, of course, they were vegetarian. And the Irish Farm Produce Cafe was one of 2 places in Dublin and probably in Ireland at the time that were serving vegetarian food. So he and his fellow students, radicals all, who wanted to see the British out of India the way the Irish wanted to see the British out of Ireland, they were congregating at this place, and they were meeting with Fenians and the IRB and radical socialists and all that, and they got really inspired by these guys and took their tactics and ideas back to India with them and translated it into their own pacifist versions with Gandhi, etc., to help with the liberation of India. So there's a direct connection between what happened in India and the vegetarian movement in Dublin. So I was coming across these things as I was researching the book, and I was dumbstruck by all this. I've been involved in animal rights since I was about 15, and I thought I knew most of what little there was to know about the Irish history of this, and I really didn't. I mean, back then, pre-internet, information was very fragmented and localized. And if you didn't read a certain issue of a day's paper from a certain place on a given day, then any news contained in there was lost to you then, pretty much forever. So it's only since the internet came along and so on that all this information is now available, at least to someone like me. So going on nowadays, we have the vegetarian scene around the country is the vegan scene. Sorry, I see to say something about so at that time, vegetarianism was typically seen as the cutting edge of animal rights. Nowadays, of course, it's veganism. But back then, the restaurants were all vegetarian. Veganism wasn't really a thing as such. But nowadays, it's completely different. You have the Dublin Food Co-op. You have Cornucopia, which has been going for years. Govinda's, which is run by the Hare Krishnas, who aren't actually, strictly speaking, vegetarians. They're Pasadians or something. They only eat food that has been sanctioned by Krishna, which happens to be vegetarian, but they're really into milk, right? They think that milk is the fruit of the gods. Literally, they think it's the tears of the gods or something like that. They really have a high regard for dairy milk for some reason. It's written into their scriptures. So they're handy enough, but it's vegetarian rather than vegan food with them. You have places like this, like the Golden Dawn restaurant. These are all sort of Dublin city centre ones, and they've been going for years, and they've been stalwarts in the vegetarian vegan community, really. And slowly, their menus have shifted from primarily vegetarian to primarily vegan, I would say. Then down here we have Gyro's on the bottom left. There's Gyro's Cafe in Belfast, which was the sort of canteen wing of the Warzone anarcho-punk collective in Belfast that lasted on and off for about 30 years during the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century. So it was a hub for punks and art students in the city centre. It actually occupied a venue in the city centre when at that time there was nothing going on in Belfast city centre except for car bombs and security checkpoints. So places like Warzone and Gyro's were unique in providing a social gathering place in the city centre for Catholics and Protestants. Okay, and they were very open about that, and they were the only sort of vegan anarchist thing that was going on in the north at the time. But they were really active and brilliant bunch of people. Then on the right here, with the Key Co-op going since 1982 in Cork. It occupies the buildings on either side of it now. It's really grown in the 40 or so years of its existence, and it's an excellent spot. It's been a radical hub for excellent vegan food, meeting point, all sorts been going on there since its inception. Now, moving on to the spikier end of the direct action movement, I suppose, the sort of Animal Liberation Front and the Hunt Saboteurs. Now, I was never involved in the Animal Liberation Front. I was, however, involved in the Hunt Saboteurs. I didn't meet people years back on the very peripheries of the ALF, but it wasn't something that I was ever involved in myself. So I can talk about this openly. All the information that we're going to come across here is publicly available. It's where I found it myself. So the sources of information are, as I said, the Irish Newspaper Archive, so the mainstream media, if you like, also the ALF supporters group, Diary of Actions newsletters, which were distributed periodically throughout the 80s and 90s as editors went in and out of prison for various reasons. And the Howl magazine from the Hunt Saboteurs Association. So between these three basic sources, I was able to find and then corroborate all the information that we're about to come across here. So Howl, that's the Hunt Saboteurs magazine, which is still in print, and it's an excellent magazine. This is the Diary of Actions from the Animal Liberation Front, and this is how it was presented. It was a series of bullet points of dates containing actions. So 27 shops in Bristol area were either super glued or had slogans and so on. So it sort of goes into detail of everything that was done in a given period of time. So it had an international section also, and the mainstream media were carrying a lot of this stuff. This is all headlines from various Irish newspapers, generally local newspapers, telling stories of recent ALF activity in the area. This is from the 80s and 90s. Here we go. Here's a picture of a bunch of butchers' windows in Cork City, about a dozen in one night. Were all painted with the slogan "Meat is Murder." It was about 2 weeks after the "Meat is Murder" album came out by the Smiths, and I wonder if that's a coincidence or not. And here the butchers are clearing off the slogans painted on their windows. So it just goes on that there's tons of details of, and the odd photograph of various animal liberation front activities. So essentially the ALF, let's see, the ALF started in Ireland in 1982, and they started in the north of Ireland, specifically Belfast. And the Belfast Animal Liberation Front cell were easily the most belligerent and most militant throughout their existence. They were busted in the early 1990s, and a few of them went to a prison. But whilst they were active throughout the 80s and into the 90s as well, they were highly active. They said they had access to gel-ignite bombs they had got from the Provisional IRA, and they were using them on hundreds of vehicles and butcher shops all around the area. It's quite a wave of actions there for about 10 or 20 years. Generally speaking, the animal liberation fronts in Ireland, as well as the UK, and I would say internationally, went into decline around 2010 onwards. So from the early 1980s right up to about 2010, around that 30-year period, there were hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of actions in Ireland, generally small scale. It was generally a brick through a window, or locks being super glued, or walls being spray painted, the odd arson. Very rarely there was an animal liberation. It was usually what the police would describe as petty vandalism, I suppose. We see here on Lower Broxton from the Nara, helping to, this is the world's first open liberation of live lobsters from a restaurant, as far as I know. There was the odd sort of lone wolf. There's a guy up here, I forget his name, it's in the detail here, but he kicked his way into a KFC wearing a balaclava, and he sprayed the customers and staff with some sort of CS gas, and was caught sort of minutes later, and was sentenced to 3 years. He was unaffiliated with any group. This was his first and only action, if that's what you call it. His lawyer pleaded that he had some sort of mental health issues, I think, and he didn't claim it under any name. He was doing it because he was outraged at the fast food industry's treatment of animals, and this is his way of letting loose, I suppose. But generally speaking, the actions in Ireland were extremely it was economic sabotage. There wasn't any direct violence against humans. In fact, all the violence involved, it was directed at the animal rights activists, particularly the Hunt Saboteurs. So animal rights activists aren't violent people, but they do attract violence at some certain points, especially whilst out sabbing. So so there was a load of ALF activity for about 20 or 30 years throughout the country, mainly in the cities, mainly small acts of vandalism. And then, as I say, it petered off into the 21st century. And if there's one or two actions a year now, that's it, it's tops. And generally there isn't anything. So it's fair to say that for now it's died out. I would guess that the ubiquity of surveillance and the severeness of punishments have both combined to put a bit of a chokehold on it. So the origins of the ALF, to understand the mindset and the philosophy of the ALF, it's sort of useful to go into the origins of the movement, which originate with this guy in the middle here, Ronnie, and I know he's listening tonight as well. So it was Ronnie Lee and another chap called Cliff Goodman who started up a group called the Band of Mercy initially, and they were all about taking direct action against local fox hunts, including the Vale of Aylesbury, I believe, which is a fox hunt that I spent years sabotaging in the late 1990s as well. So Ronnie and a few other people took it upon themselves to sort of broaden the struggle, I suppose, and include acts of vandalism and sabotaging hunters' vehicles, as well as the hunting itself, as a valid tactic. That soon spread to include, on the left here, we see a semi-burned out fishing boat that was going to be used for a seal cull in the Wash in the early 70s, I believe. And this is on the right here, this is the very first communique from the Band of Mercy. This is the first written example of a militant group acting on behalf of animals, sending a communique out into the wider world. So this note on the right here, its significance is hard to overstate, really. It was the formal start, I suppose, the formal declaration of resistance to human cruelty to animals ever recorded, I suppose. So Ronnie went on to, so the original Bands of Mercy were these guys here, and that's where Ronnie took the name from. They were vegetarian, Christian, evangelical choir groups that used to go around singing songs in praise of kindness towards animals and things like this. They were also known to sabotage hunting guns and maybe rescue animals that were destined to be experimented on at the time as well. So this is the 18th century. This is a long time ago, and the Bands of Mercy were massive over in the States. Thousands upon thousands of kids from the ages of about 5 to about 15. It was a bit like a Boy Scouts or a Girl Guides for kids that were concerned about animals and animal welfare. They weren't necessarily vegetarian or anything as radical as that, I suppose, but their hearts were in the right place. And so this Band of Mercy went on to inspire the 1970s version of Bands of Mercy, which went on to become the Animal Liberation Front. And things really stepped up a gear after Ronnie and Cliff Goodman were apprehended and sentenced to 3 years in prison. They served about a year, and when they came out of prison, Cliff Goodman got the hell out of Dodge and became an animal rights informer, the very first, and took no more part in any more activity. Ronnie, on the other hand, went on to help form and push through the Animal Liberation Front, and some of their actions in the UK were legendary, and they were a huge source. I presume they were a huge source of inspiration for activists all around the world, including Ireland. Very few countries matched the UK's ALF's level of militancy. I mean, you see here on the bottom that this is a department store. This is Dingle's department store in Plymouth, burned to the ground by the Animal Liberation Front in 1987, I think, because they were selling fur coats. This is a similar department store in Luton around the same time, again burned to the ground with incendiary devices. There was the Mars Bar hoax, when Mars Bar company were cynically funding research into tooth decay by experimenting on monkeys. And the ALF decided to go directly for the jugular. And what they did was they pretended that they had put poison into random Mars bars and distributed them in shelves in shops around the country. And as a result, the media blew up around this, and Mars had to employ about 1,000 people to withdraw every Mars bar from every shop in every store in the country at the cost of millions. And they immediately stopped funding the experimentation. So it gives you a pause to consider when I was coming across these stories and understanding the little narratives inside the sort of broader narrative. Another an above ground legal animal rights organization could have spent years pursuing Mars, pleading with them to stop funding the animal experiments, pleading with politicians to enforce or bring in laws around this. getting petitions signed, etc., etc., to maybe little or no end. The ALF, in about a 3-week period, attacked and defeated this massive company for the price of about €5 worth of chocolate. They managed to bring this company almost to its knees and force them out of animal experimentation permanently. So direct action can have an extremely potent effect when in cases like this. So it was very interesting. So obviously the ALF are also known for breaking in to labs and freeing animals, and there's a whole spectrum of actions there, from very benign and PR friendly actions like freeing rabbits that are destined for vivisection, to food poisoning hoaxes, to arson. I mean, the whole lot was there. So in Ireland, it never got anywhere near that sort of level of intensity. And let me see what this. So, but where around the same time as the ALF started in Ireland, the militant anti-coursing movements got into stride. So, and again, it was up in the north of Ireland where the genesis of this was. So these people in this photograph are from Queen's University of Belfast Anti-Blood Sport Society, a very early direct action focused or civil disobedience focused group against coursing. Coursing in Ireland is a bit different from how it used to be in the UK. In the UK, it used to be open hair coursing. In Ireland, it's called park hair coursing, where the hair it's in an enclosed, fenced off or walled off field, and the hair has no chance of escape at all. So it's that bit more cruel. So here we see, this is 1982. This is Creebelly coursing grounds, and this is a sit-down blockade of the entrance to the stadium where the coursing is meant to take place. So this is the first photographic evidence of civil disobedience being done in the name of animal welfare, I suppose in this case, anywhere in Ireland. So these guys were the genesis of that whole movement. Okay, and we see them here. There's an invasion of the coursing field itself, and this person being dragged off by farmer security, and more in 1984. So year after year, the Queen's University Belfast Anti-Blood Sports Group used to organize blockades and so on of the Creebelly coursing. It was like an all-Ireland coursing thing every year there. It was a Greyhound Stadium that they would either try and invade or blockade. And you see the RUC here, who are very well used to dealing with crowds, manhandling people and blocking them from getting where they want to go. So coursing was, as opposed to Hunt Sabotage, even though it is a form of Hunt Sabotage in a sense, it was the actions against it were done primarily by people acting under the banner of the ALF. And one of the common tactics of the ALF at this time was to put down these small tacks and spread them, just toss them casually over a field that was destined to be used for a coursing the following day. And maybe paint the tacks green as well, the same green as the grass, so they're even harder to find. And then you get in touch with the landowner and you tell them that the field has been spiked essentially, and anything moving on it is likely to get attack inside them. So it was enormously successful in slowing down, if not stopping, coursing on any given day, where they would have to walk in a long, slow line and pick up every tack that was left there. So actions against coursing were very, very common throughout the 80s and 90s. Here, this is produced in court. This is a threatening letter sent by an anti-coursing activist to a landowner. And it says here, "We'll petrol bomb your lovely house. What we did at Ballyraggett, Blarney, Mooncoin, Whitfield, Johnston, Cappoquin, and other places is a picnic compared to what you will suffer if any coursing is held on your land." So that's a reference there to what they were doing to property of landowners in other areas. I think this is in Cork. Yeah, and this is a letter produced in court as a guy called John Fitzgerald from ICABS, I think, was being prosecuted for this, which he was found innocent on, by the way. Here, we will continue to use ruthless methods against ruthless men. This is a communique by the ALF in Cork, again, I think, to the local media, threatening any landowner who allowed coursing on their land would be a target, essentially. Okay, and then things that stepped up a bit down south as well when they saw what was going on up in Creebelly, up in the north of Ireland. ICABS decided to get into the civil disobedience game briefly during the late 80s. This is them blockading the Clonmel National Coursing Final, which I was protesting. I think I was there the following year. They blockaded the 2 out of the 3 entrances, I think. And then the crowd turned on them, and the police arrested the ICABS demonstrators for their own safety. They would have been ripped to shreds by the angry coursing crowd, it seems. So this is their first and only time at the time. This is their first sort of foray into civil disobedience, and they didn't repeat it for as long as I was around until the mid 90s. I think they had tried it and found it wasn't something that they were comfortable with. I think this is Creebelly up in the north of Ireland. It was burnt to the ground by the ALF in 1991. Took them about a year to fix it all up again at a huge cost. This on the right here, this is the Master McGrath statue. I think it's outside Waterford, and it's a statue. It's still there. It's commemorating a greyhound, McGrath, the Master McGrath, who was particularly good at coursing, it seems. And it's been vandalized on a number of occasions by the ALF in the area. They've poured tar over it and red paint and so on. And this is all the coursing locals coming out after a recent attack. This is in the 1980s, I think, or 1990s, clearing up the statue and making it all nice and shiny again, ready to be attacked by the ALF again. This is Pat Phelan from the Irish Council Against Blood Sports, who was their spokesperson at the time. I'm not sure who's the spokesperson now, and I believe ICABs are a bit less conservative than they used to be. But anytime there was an ALF action, like freeing hares from an enclosure, hares that were due to be tortured to death the following day on coursing fields, ICABs would always come out and condemn the ALF action. But regardless of that, the police used to often arrest Pat Phelan and hold him for 12 or 24 hours for a questioning around recent ALF attacks in a given area. So Pat Phelan couldn't do enough to tell the media how much he hated the ALF, but nevertheless, the police had no one else to go on, it seems. And because there wasn't really any animal rights groups to spy on at the time, I think the police just didn't know where to start. So they would assume that someone like Pat Phelan here must be connected to the ALF, because they didn't know anyone else who was talking about this. To a point where the on the right here we see a really badly produced photograph of a joint demonstration outside Clonmel police station by ICABS and a tiny group called the Catholic Animal Welfare Society or something. This is the only time that the Catholic Animal Welfare Society ever took part in a demonstration. It happens to be outside a police station, as they condemned the police for being in cahoots with the local coursers and trying to suppress any anti-coursing activity by continuously raiding and arresting and interrogating people like Pat Phelan. So they were accusing the police of working with the blood sports enthusiasts of that area, and these are two very, very conservative groups. So you've got to think there must be something in that if groups like this, as timid as this, are coming out for a demonstration. So moving on then to the Hunt Saboteurs, which started in Ireland in the 1990s, again in the north of Ireland. This photograph was quite a well-known one from the late 90s. That's me on the right here. That's a friend of mine, Alan, singer from an anarcho-punk band called the Chineapple Punks, being dragged off a field by a huntsman. This is another friend of ours, Duke, trying to get past security here. The security have cameras on their sort of wrapped around their hands here. Yeah, so this is the Hunt Saboteurs Association started in the UK back in the 1960s. But the very first Hunt sabotage, and I was awestruck at this, was organized by this guy on the top left here, a priest, Father Eugene Sheehy. He was the parish priest for Brewery in Limerick, and the local landlord, the much despised local landlord John Gubbins here, was threatening to evict some local tenants. So Father Sheehy organized with the local GAA hurling team, who were down here on the bottom right, to blockade access to lands that Gubbins wished to hunt on for the following fox hunting season. So in order to put pressure on Gubbins to not evict the three tenant families he was threatening to evict, they denied him access to his hunting lands, and they kept this up for an entire season. Anytime that Gubbins and his mates were seen on horseback and with a load of dogs about to set off on a hunt, they'd call the local GAA team together, and they'd come out with their hurleys and their slitters en masse and stand in front of them and block them. And they did this for an entire season. And it was so effective that Gubbins sold his horses at the end of that season and disbanded the fox hunting club. And he was killed a few years later when a horse fell on him as he was trying to jump over a fence. So the irony there isn't lost on anyone. And up on the top right here is Eamon de Valera, who's rumored to be Gubbins' son, and who was an altar boy in the local church that Sheehy was the parish priest for. So there's a connection here between the very first Hunt Saboteur, which is Father Sheehy here, the very first victim of Hunt Sabotage, which is John Gubbins down here, and Eamon de Valera, who's the father of conservative militant Irish republicanism. So it's wheels within wheels, really. There's details of history here. There's connections that I never thought would be there, you know, and it's quite fascinating, really. And then up on the top left here, we have three of the very earliest Hunt Saboteurs. Their heads are chopped off here. But on the far right, you have John Prestige, who was the guy who started up the Hunt Saboteurs. Prior to him, actually, there was a woman called Gwen Barton, I think is her surname. She was with the League Against Cruel Sports, who at the time, during the 1950s and 60s, were the main anti-blood sports group. And some of their members, if not the leadership, were a little bit radical, including this woman, Gwen here, who took it upon herself to sit down on the metal grill of the lead vehicle of this beagle hunt here, somewhere in Northamptonshire, I think, in 1963. This is the first image of someone taking civil disobedience on behalf of animals that I know of. So she's essentially the Rosa Parks of the animal rights movement. She inspired people like these three guys up top who, after witnessing a stag hunt in which a female animal was chased to her death, and she was pregnant, and they slashed open her belly and pulled out the still alive fetus of the stag inside her, and so on. It was really gruesome, and these guys were covering for a newspaper, and they were disgusted by it, and decided to go out and sabotage hunts instead of merely protesting them. So here on the far right, this is what these guys, this is what the hunters are prepared to do to animals. This poor fox here had been ripped in half, right? And then they smeared the blood of their animal victims on the new members of the hunts to sort of blood them into it. It's like a pagan ritual in a sense. So the hunting fraternity are exceptionally violent people, although they like to give the impression of being the sort of backbone of the countryside. But when you're up close personal with them, you see what they're really like. So this image here, I'm not sure where this is from, but it could be from anywhere. The one on the far right here, a huntswoman whipping a Hunt Saboteur with her riding crop here. Here's a guy about to throw a rock at Hunt Saboteurs, being encouraged by his mates behind him. Here's Alan, my friend, the singer from that band, being dragged off. Here's the police, only too willing to do the hunters' work for them, and they were at their beck and call almost as much as the hounds were. And the hunters could pretty much order the police around and tell them what to do and how to do it. and the police would go ahead and do that. Here you see them scuffling with a lot of Hunt Saboteurs. So it got to a point in the UK where the violence was becoming more and more extreme, and the police were continuing to turn a blind eye, and the judges and the courts were failing to impose any restrictions on these people for violence. So it came to a point where they were actually bringing in, see on the very top here, you see these are gangsters from the East End, basically coming down to act as Hunt security. They had a bit more formal security. These guys are from a group called Countryside Watch, who were set up by a New Zealander. So that happens. And again, they would stop us from going on, or Hunt Saboteurs from going on to privately owned land. You can see they're basically bouncers, and they were used extensively during the 90s to protect the hunting community from the saboteurs' activities. So everything had to step up a gear on the Hunt Saboteur side as well. And as the state were bringing in new laws, and as the hunting community were drafting in their own security, as well as using the formal police, things really came to a head in the mid 1990s, I would say, or the 1990s generally. Things got quite extreme, where you had, on the very top here, you see more countryside security blocking access to a public path. This is in Surrey, I think. And it was behavior like this where they themselves were flagrantly breaking the law by denying the public right of access to public pathways. Things really kicked off. And on the bottom here, you see this is the Brixton mob, they're known as. So in Brixton and around South London at the time, this is the 1990s, there was a massive squat scene, an anarchist squat scene full of UK and European anti-fascists and punks and squatters and anarchists and so on. And a lot of them were only too willing to get involved in something like this. So when things got particularly heavy and the Hunt security were out of control, then people like the Brixton mob would arrive down, and their approach to a Hunt sabotage was to swamp the area with loads of people and use essentially violence and intimidation and the threat of intimidation, or the threat of violence to intimidate the hunt from even starting. So there was some massive battles before this thing sort of settled down to a more even keel. During the 1990s, you could have hundreds on each side meeting in woods and clashing, and there wouldn't be any police around. It would just be like a massive fight between hundreds of people on both sides. Generally speaking, the Hunt Saboteurs won because they had the backing of people like this. And this isn't Hunt sabotage, but this is the defense of Hunt sabotage. So you had the only political strain that was interested in what the ALF and the Hunt Saboteurs were doing were anarchists at the time. I would say it's possibly still true today. The left, and the far left in particular, were not interested in this, even though the animal rights movement in the 80s and 90s in the UK were doing way more direct action against capitalism than the far left combined, multiplied by 10 and then some. So the far left had no interest in animal rights. The only, as I say, the only political strain that was genuinely interested was people like class warriors. So you see up in the top left here, you see this magazine. This is the front cover of one of the issues of Class War. So they were directly encouraging their readership to go out and help the Hunt Saboteurs. To them, it was a class angle. But either way, as a result, there was often hundreds of people that looked like this black bloc here that would arrive down in van after van after van, all of them painted black with metal grills over the windscreens, with punk rock blaring out, and they'd arrive into a meet and they'd all disembark, and there'd be dozens and dozens, or maybe hundreds of guys that looked like this, milling around, ready to sabotage and not willing to take any crap from the Hunt security, which you can see down on the bottom left here. This is Irish Kev facing up against all the goons that were drafted in the East End to help the Surrey Union, I think, at the time. So it was a very bitter time. There was deaths there was 2 saboteurs killed around this time. There was a hunter killed during, I think it was 2010, actually. He had his head chopped off by a gyrocopter blade, but it's another story. So here we see saboteurs arriving en masse to the Surrey Union. Again, loads and loads of people. So some Hunt Saboteurs groups, the ones that I was with in Ireland and in the UK, we were small, tightly knit groups of friends, maybe 6 to 12 people out in the Sab on average. Some of the groups that were closer to London could get hundreds of people out on a given day. On the far right here, we have a scene from, this is the Hunt Retribution Squad, who were formed as an informal offshoot, I suppose, of the Hunt Saboteurs, in order to deliver violence directly back to problematic hunts, in order to quell the violence that was coming from these hunts. So here we see the Hursley and Hambledon hunt in Hampshire being hit by about 100 Hunt Retribution Squad activists who came down and spent about 10 minutes vandalizing every hunt vehicle that they could, and then left the area. There was dozens of them arrested hours later by the police, but all the charges were dropped eventually. So the Hunt Retribution Squad were a response to the extreme violence that the Hunt Saboteurs were encountering every week that they were out. They're less active, if they're active at all, these days. But again, they were a response to a particularly violent time. And once that violence subsided, so did groups like the Hunt Retribution Squad. But again, it's to give you a flavor of the intensity and the bravery of the saboteurs in the face of shocking violence at times. So I had my own experience with violent hunts in Galway back in the mid-1990s when we sabotaged the Galway Blazers, and I go into some detail in the book. But we were basically ambushed on our third hunt sabotage of the Blazers back in January 1995, and had the shit kicked out of us really badly in front of the police, who didn't do anything about it and who wouldn't press any charges on our behalf either. We were really left high and dry. I left the country about 6 months after this and immediately got involved in the UK Hunt Saboteurs, particularly the Hertfordshire Hunt Saboteurs, right up to the ban in 2004. But yeah, but my first forays into hunt sabotage were in the west of Ireland, and they were really intense because the Galway Blazers were aware of the Hunt Saboteurs, and the last thing that they wanted was a group like that taking root in their area. They were determined to squash it as soon as it showed its face, and they did. I'm glad to say that the Galway Blazers are still being sabbed these days since 2019. Okay, and there's active groups of saboteurs around the country still. Here we see some in the north of Ireland, blockading a hunt from coming out and so on. So despite all the violence, despite the biased policing, the Hunt Saboteurs are still in existence and have spread. Actually, they're also active in North France, Belgium, as well as Ireland and the UK. So a lot of this comes from, and I hope I'm not going too over my time here, but there isn't that many slides left, so hopefully, okay. So a lot of the foot soldiers for all this, and a lot of the inspiration for the movement, I would say, came from the anarcho-punk movement, which, if you're not familiar with it, it was sort of a second wave of punk that came after the groups like the Sex Pistols or the Clash crashed and burned, basically. And they were grassroots, genuinely anarchistic form of punk rock. And it was the movement was really into animal rights, okay? And there was some bands that really pushed that whole philosophy really hard, like Conflict and Flux of Pink Indians and Crass, who we see here. So these guys wrote songs, distributed records, organized actions, distributed fanzines, did interviews, all with the single purpose of encouraging people to question capitalism, to question animal abuse and their part in it, to think about going vegetarian and vegan. It was pushing a very hardcore anarchist interpretation of society that really included animals and animal rights, and put that right at the center of its philosophy, and was an inspiration for probably a small amount of people, but was a huge inspiration for these people. And most of these people who were really into these bands became active in some sort of peace movement or animal rights movement or what have you. Up here on the top left, we see Paranoid Visions, who were Dublin's answer to Crass, I suppose. Again, really into the anarcho message, into animal rights. Down here, we have Colin Gerwood, who from Conflict, who really pushed the whole agenda as well. So it was this movement in combination with the grassroots direct action animal rights movement that these two groups worked together to provide each other with inspiration and foot soldiers and so on, and money. These bands were all about raising money and funds for the groups that they supported, like the ALF and so on, and the Hunt Saboteurs. And finally, I think there were some personalities that I'd never heard of in my life that were really famous in their day. The guy here we see is a guy called Jack McClelland, who was I think he's from Belfast, and he was sort of a polymath in terms of athletics. He was an extreme swimmer. He would swim from Tory Island to the mainland, and from he swam Galway Bay when it was freezing cold, and he'd refused to wear any goose fat on his skin as an insulation because he was a hardcore vegan. He set up his own chain of health food shops. He really pushed the vegan line, and this is in the sort of 60s and 70s. He was a famous athlete, and there should be statues of him everywhere because he was good at so many different sports. But he barely gets a mention these days, even though he smashed loads of records. He was a weightlifter. He was a record-holding swimmer. He was a top footballer. He was a boxer. He was all these different things. He was brilliant at all of them, and he was a hardcore vegan. And again, he's an essential part of the history of the animal rights movement in Ireland. And I'd never heard of the guy. So his name is Jack McClelland. There's footage of him on YouTube swimming places like Galway Bay and other stunts like this. But yeah, so he's well worth checking out. So I talk a little bit about him, and I also mentioned a woman called Maura Henry, who during the 30s and 1940s and 1950s was one of the only vegans in Ireland, I would say. And this is her under the blue arrow here at the World Vegetarian Congress in London, I think, during the 1930s. And again, she was a stalwart vegan. And she used to make her own clothes and her own makeup, and she was the head of the Irish Union Against Vivisection and the head of the Vegetarian Society, but vegan herself. And she was quite well known. She was quite a personality in her day. Again, she was someone I'd never heard of, and it's great. So I can't go through this without mentioning the amounts of police infiltration of the movement. It was probably not as big in Ireland as it was in the UK. The picture we're seeing here is a female police officer undercover called Christine Green. That was her alias. No one knows her real name, but she has spent a few years spying on us. The Vale of Aylesbury Hunt Saboteur. She'd come out in these hunts with us on a regular basis. She was always very feisty. She was quite aggressive with the hunt stewards and the hunt security. She was a very good hunt sab, and she was an excellent driver down these narrow country lanes going at 60 or 70 miles an hour. She was a police trained driver, of course, and no one knew this at the time. But that's why she was so good at driving. She was given special training for this, and she used to come out week after week with us. And then she disappeared, and it came out in the media around the same time as the Mark Kennedy expose that she was in fact an undercover spy who was sent in amongst along with many other people to spy on the movement here. Mark Kennedy, it should be noted, spied on the movement in Ireland extensively, as well as the UK. So it was just a point I came across. It isn't as much to do with Ireland as it is to do with England. And then down here we see the Hunt Saboteur group that I was with. I tell a few stories about that in my book as well. A few anecdotes. This is us, the last hunt of the season, sometime in late March, when this would be their very last time going out until the next season starts in September. So we tried a few different tactics. So in this one here, we blockaded the hunt, and we're sitting down in front of the horse box van here, and blockading. That's me on the balaclava on here, standing in front of the horse box here and refusing to leave it go out. So we tried different tactics on the very last day of a hunt to see if anything worked. And another time we made it onto the ITN news by dressing up in drag to emphasize drag hunting and marching into the field where the meat was meeting with these banners saying time to turn to drag ducky and hunting makes me cross, and then in brackets dress, pantyhose not tallyhose, all this sort of stuff. So yeah, so we went dressed in drag for a hunt as well. So there was some fun to be had as well. And that's it. That's the end of the presentation. I did this last night, so it's a little bit rushed. There was a lot more going on in the book to be and in the website that is available now. But this is a good introduction to the contents of the book and to the broad history of 200 years of advocacy for animals in Ireland, 1822 to 2022. So that's the end of the presentation. I would love to hear any comments or any questions from anyone.